The morning smelled like warm bread and clean flour. It had been ordinary bread cooling on the racks. The low crackle of the oven, the familiar comfort of a life rebuilt piece by careful piece. Susan was wiping her hands on her apron when the sound of the door opening made her glance up, nothing more than habit, nothing more than routine. Then her daughter froze at the threshold. Jane stared at the man standing just beyond the doorway, her small hand tightening around the wooden frame as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. The man looked older, thinner, dust clinging to his coat like he had walked a very long way to get there. Jane turned slowly, eyes wide, but certain. "Mommy, it's Dad," she said, her voice steady in a way that broke something open in Susan's chest. Susan's breath stopped. Susan Williams had learned to live with the certainty that the dead did not come back. For 3 years, she had carried that truth like a stone in her chest. 3 winters, 3 springs, 3 long summers baking bread in Fred Meyer's shop, telling herself that the man she once loved had been taken by a road that gave nothing back. Caleb Williams was gone. The wagon had fallen. The valley had swallowed her husband. That was the story she survived on. And now, the man she had buried in her heart was standing in her doorway, very much alive. Before we continue, let me know if you were standing where Susan stands now. What would you do? Share your thoughts and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, consider supporting the channel with a like or subscription. Susan grew up in a small frontier town where mornings began before the sun and ended only when the ovens cooled. Her father's bakery sat near the center of town, close enough to the church that she could hear the bells through the walls, close enough to the road that dust settled into every crack of the wooden floorboards. It was honest work, steady work, the kind of life that promised safety, but little else. In the years between 1806 and 1808, the town felt smaller than it ever had before. The Louisiana Purchase reshaped how ordinary Americans imagined their future. It was not merely a political transaction between governments, but a psychological turning point for an entire generation. Suddenly, the nation felt unfinished in the best possible way. Vast stretches of land existed beyond familiar towns, not yet claimed by history or expectation, for young people like Susan and Caleb. The purchase transformed westward movement from reckless wandering into a moral opportunity. It suggested that ambition, migration, and reinvention were not acts of escape, but expressions of citizenship. The frontier became a promise rather than a risk, and love itself began to imagine a horizon instead of a home. It was not that the land had changed. The streets were the same narrow lines of packed dirt. The fences still leaned the way they always had. But the idea of the world had grown larger. Men came through town talking about territories newly opened, about lands so wide a man could ride all day and still not see the end of it. They spoke of rivers no map could yet name, and valleys untouched by fences or deeds. The country was young, restless, and hungry for movement. Susan heard those stories while kneading dough. She listened as customers lingered longer than necessary, voices low and excited, passing along rumors like precious coins. To her, the words sounded distant at first, like something meant for other people. She had been raised to believe that a good life was one you stayed in, a life you kept warm, fed, and orderly. Then she met Caleb Williams. He was the rancher's son, tall for his age even then, with sun-browned skin and eyes that never seemed to rest in one place for long. He came into the bakery one afternoon with his father, smelling of leather and horse sweat, tracking dust across the floor without noticing. Susan remembered being annoyed at him before she ever noticed the way he smiled. Caleb did not talk like the other boys in town. He did not speak about what he would inherit or what he was expected to become. When he talked, he spoke in directions rather than plans. West, north, beyond the next ridge, beyond the places people already knew. Susan told herself she did not belong to that kind of dreaming. But she listened. They grew up alongside each other. Caleb helped her father unload flour sacks when deliveries came in. Susan patched his shirts when he tore them on barbed wire. Their lives overlapped so naturally that no one ever marked the moment when friendship became something else. It simply did. By the time Susan was old enough to understand the restlessness stirring in the country, it was already stirring inside Caleb. He would stand outside the bakery at dusk, leaning against the railing, watching the road as if it might speak back to him. He talked about the land the way some men talked about God, as something vast and waiting, something that rewarded those brave enough to move toward it. Before she met Caleb, Susan had never wanted to leave. Her world was predictable. The rhythm of the bakery soothed her. The smells, the heat, the way flour dust hung in the air like pale fog, it grounded her. She believed stability was a virtue, that wanting more was a kind of ingratitude. But Caleb looked at her as if she were not meant to stay in one place. He told her that the country was changing faster than people realized, that the old towns would be left behind, that a life built early, in the right place, could mean freedom for their children. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed motion itself was proof of purpose. Susan was not impressed with his words, but she fell in love with the way he believed them. In those years, love felt inseparable from movement. The nation itself seemed to be leaning westward, urging its young forward. Staying behind began to feel like choosing a smaller version of oneself. Susan did not want to be small in Caleb's eyes. She did not want to be the reason he stayed when the whole world was calling him outward. So she learned to imagine a life beyond the bakery. She imagined kneading dough in new kitchens, teaching her children to recognize unfamiliar stars, building a home where no one knew who her father was or what she had been born into. With Caleb beside her, the unknown felt less like danger and more like promise. They spoke of leaving as if it were inevitable, not reckless, not dramatic, just the next honest step. Susan told herself that love meant trusting the direction the other person faced. That if she loved Caleb, she had to believe the road mattered as much as he did. The country rewarded boldness in those years, or so everyone said. No one warned us that the cost would be paid in silence. I didn't know then how quietly you can be trained to ignore your own hunger while tending to someone else's. By the time you notice, you are already walking away from yourself. Susan never remembered a single moment when she and Caleb Williams became inseparable. It happened the way seasons changed quietly, without asking permission. Caleb appeared at the bakery almost every afternoon, sometimes with a reason, often without one. He leaned against the counter while she worked, talking just enough to fill the space without demanding it. When she asked where he was headed next, he would shrug and smile, as if direction itself were something he carried lightly. "You ever wonder what's past the river?" he asked her once. Susan did not look up from the dough. Past the river is more river. That's what folks say when they haven't crossed it. She told herself she didn't like the way he spoke, always turning questions into invitations. Yet she found herself listening for his boots on the floorboards, feeling something settle in her chest when he was near. Caleb did not push her to agree with him. Their first real journey together was not far, just a day's ride beyond the familiar roads, to deliver supplies for a neighbor. Susan remembered how her hands shook when she climbed onto the wagon, how her breath caught when the town disappeared behind a bend in the road. Caleb noticed, but he did not tease her. "Say the word," he told her, reins loose in his hands. "We can turn back." She didn't say it. The land opened slowly, like something unfolding rather than changing. Trees thinned. The sky felt wider. Susan watched the horizon stretch in a way she had never seen from behind a counter. She felt afraid, but also strangely awake, as if part of her had been waiting for the road to reveal itself. Caleb noticed everything: the way she leaned forward when the ground dipped, the way her eyes followed the river's curve. He spoke less as the miles passed, letting the silence do its work. Susan realized then that his hunger for distance was not about escape. It was about attention, about seeing what others passed by without noticing. They stopped near dusk. Caleb built a small fire while Susan unpacked the bread she had brought. The same loaves she baked every morning. They tasted different out there, fuller somehow, as if the land itself had altered them. "This is what I mean," Caleb said, staring into the fire. "Life feels right when you move through it." Susan wanted to disagree, wanted to say that staying could be just as honest. But the words did not come. Their hands brushed when she passed him a piece of bread. Neither of them moved away. That night, Susan lay awake under unfamiliar stars, listening to the quiet and feeling her certainty loosen. When Caleb asked her, plainly this time, if she would leave with him when the moment came, Susan did not answer immediately. She thought of the bakery ovens cooling at night, of her father's quiet pride, of the life she understood. Then she looked at Caleb and felt something shift inside her. "Yes," she said at last, her voice steady, despite the fear curling beneath it. "I will." Caleb exhaled like someone who had been holding his breath for years. They did not leave right away. There were preparations to make, promises to ease, time to let the decision settle. But from that moment on, Susan began to see the town differently. The walls felt closer, the roads narrower. Stability, once comforting, now felt like something she was already outgrowing. Love, she learned, could change the scale of your world. I hear my own younger voice in Susan's certainty. I believe that choosing movement meant choosing love, that staying still meant failure. Only later did I learn how wrong that was. When they finally left, it was late spring. The land was green enough to promise mercy. The first few years on the road felt almost like a reward for their courage. They moved slowly, stopping where work was available, never staying long enough to become rooted. Susan baked in temporary kitchens, learned how to stretch flour and make bread with unfamiliar grains. Caleb worked as a ranch hand, a drover, sometimes a guide for families heading farther west than they dared go alone. They learned each other in the way only shared hardship allows. Susan learned that Caleb woke before dawn no matter how late they had slept, that he needed space the way other men needed reassurance. Caleb learned that Susan's strength was quiet but immovable, that she could endure far more than she ever admitted aloud. At night, they lay side by side beneath borrowed roofs, speaking of the future as if it were something they could still choose freely. After 4 years together, they married. It was not a wedding that drew attention. No church bells, no long guest lists, just vows spoken in the presence of a handful of witnesses who understood that love on the frontier was less about ceremony and more about survival. Susan wore a simple dress she had sewn herself. Caleb held her hands like he was afraid the world might interrupt them. For a time, marriage changed things. They stayed in one place for the longest they ever had before, in a growing settlement where the land was fertile and the roads promising. Susan baked regularly again, her days regaining a rhythm that felt familiar. Caleb worked land that could have been theirs if they had chosen to claim it. They talked, cautiously, about staying. Then Jane was born. Motherhood grounded Susan in a way she had not expected. Time narrowed. Distance lost its appeal. The world became measured in feedings and sleep, in the fragile weight of a child against her chest. Susan discovered that love could exist without movement, that staying could be its own kind of bravery. Caleb tried. For nearly 3 years, he did everything a settled man was supposed to do. He rose early, worked long hours, spoke of the future in terms of permanence. But Susan noticed the small things. The way he lingered when strangers passed through town. The way his attention sharpened at the mention of new routes being cut farther west. Caleb spoke of another move not immediately. He said, "But soon. A better opportunity. Land not yet crowded. A chance to give Jane more than they had." Susan listened, her arms around their daughter, feeling something fracture quietly inside her. Susan wrestled with the decision longer than she admitted. They had been together almost 10 years, more than half her life. Loving Caleb had shaped her into the woman she was. Saying no felt like denying the past. Saying yes felt like abandoning the present. In the end, Susan agreed. She feared what refusing might cost them. She told herself that stability could be rebuilt anywhere, that Jane would adapt, that love, once tested, would emerge stronger for it. They left when Jane was old enough to walk, old enough to remember the sound of wheels turning beneath her. Susan told herself it was only another chapter, another step in the life she had chosen. She did not yet know that this journey would be the one that would divide her life cleanly into before and after. What stayed with me was not the length of time Susan had known Caleb, but how she had mistaken devotion for love. I recognized myself in that mistake, in the belief that loving someone meant following them. Even after my own heart had grown tired and quiet. But now I understand how dangerous that thinking is. The moment you stop listening to your own needs, you begin to disappear. And looking back, I see it clearly. The breaking did not come suddenly. It began the first time Susan chose Caleb's direction over her own voice. The day the road turned against them did not feel dangerous at first. The morning had broken clear and quiet. The kind of calm that lulled travelers into believing the land meant them no harm. Susan sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat, Jane bundled between them, her small fingers wrapped in the edge of Susan's shawl. The wheels creaked steadily, a familiar sound that had come to mean progress rather than risk. Susan watched the land pass and tried to quiet the unease she could not name. They had taken this route because others said it was faster. A narrow stretch that cut through a rise of rock and trees before opening into gentler country. Caleb handled the reins with practiced confidence, guiding the horses into the turn as the road curved sharply to the left. Susan remembered thinking, just before it happened, that the land felt strangely still. The wind had dropped. Even the horses seemed reluctant, their steps careful, ears twitching as if listening for something Susan could not hear. The curve came suddenly. The road bent sharply around a rocky outcrop, the ground sloping away into a steep ravine that disappeared into shadow. Caleb pulled the reins instinctively, but the wagon lurched, one wheel slipping where the earth had given way beneath it. Susan felt the shift before she understood it, the terrible moment when balance is lost, and the body knows what the mind refuses to accept. Caleb. The word never finished forming. The wagon tipped, wood screaming against stone. Susan felt herself thrown sideways, the world breaking into fragments of noise and motion. She wrapped her arms around Jane without thinking, her body folding inward in a reflex older than fear. Then there was the sound of something tearing loose, the sensation of weightlessness, and the sudden absence of ground. When Susan woke, pain was everywhere. Her head rang, sharp and disorienting. Her ribs burned with each breath. For a moment, she did not remember where she was or how she had come to be there. She only knew that Jane was crying thin, frightened sounds that cut through the haze and anchored Susan to the present. Susan forced her eyes open. They were lying on the edge of the road, tangled in brush and broken branches. The wagon was gone. The ravine yawned beside them, deep and dark, swallowing the light. Susan pushed herself upright with a sound she did not recognize as her own and crawled toward the drop, ignoring the way her vision blurred at the edges. "Caleb," she called, her voice raw. "Caleb." There was no answer. She leaned over the edge, heart pounding so hard it hurt, searching the shadows below for any sign of him. She saw splintered wood caught on rocks far beneath them, a torn piece of canvas. Nothing that moved, nothing that answered when she screamed his name again and again until her throat burned and her voice broke. Susan stayed there until the light began to fade. She did not know how much time passed. Minutes, hours. She clutched Jane close, rocking back and forth, whispering words she barely understood herself. She told her daughter they would wait, that Caleb would come back up the road any moment, that the land did not take what it had not earned. When footsteps finally approached, Susan did not lift her head. Fred Meyer found them just as dusk began to settle in, his horse slowing when he saw the shape of them at the roadside. He had been delivering bread to the outlying farms, following the same route he had taken 100 times before. He later said he smelled smoke first, then heard crying. Susan remembered none of that. She remembered only hands steady, careful lifting Jane, wrapping her in a blanket, speaking softly as if noise itself might shatter what little remained intact. They searched. They found nothing that looked like a body, nothing that proved he was alive, nothing that allowed grief to settle into certainty. Susan watched from the roadside, numb and shaking, her mind fixed on one impossible truth. If there was no body, then he might still come back. Fred took Susan and Jane to the town before night fully fell. He gave up his own bed and slept on the floor without complaint. A doctor came and set Susan's ribs, stitched a cut near her temple, and told her she was lucky to be alive. Susan stared at the wall and said nothing. The next morning, she asked to be taken back to the road. Fred tried to talk her out of it. Others did, too. They said there was nothing more to find, that the ravine was unforgiving, that some accidents did not leave answers behind. Susan went anyway, for weeks. She returned to that curve in the road every day she could stand upright. She walked the edge, called Caleb's name into the open air, scanned the land for any sign he might have climbed out somewhere beyond their sight. She learned the sound of the ravine at different hours, the way shadows shifted, the way hope thinned with each passing afternoon. Jane learned to be quiet there. After a month, Susan's strength failed her, not all at once, slowly. In the way exhaustion replaces desperation when the body can no longer sustain both. She realized, standing alone on that road without her daughter, that waiting was no longer an act of love. It was an act of abandonment of Jane, of the life that still required her presence. Susan returned to Fred's bakery and asked for work. She told him she could not accept charity, that she had grown up in a bakery, that her hands knew what to do even when her heart did not. Fred nodded and cleared a space for her without asking anything further. Susan baked with tears blurring her vision. Every loaf felt like an accusation. Every familiar scent reopened the questions she could not stop asking the world if Caleb was alive. Why had he not come back? And if he was dead? Why had the land refused to give her proof? The world did not pause for Susan's grief. Days stacked themselves one atop another, each demanding something of her, whether she was ready or not. Dough had to be mixed. Fires had to be lit. Jane had to be fed, washed, soothed when nightmares pulled her awake in the small hours of the night. Survival did not ask permission. And slowly, almost without Susan noticing, it became habit. Fred Meyer never spoke of the ravine unless Susan did first. He gave her space in a way that felt deliberate, almost respectful. He showed her where the flour was kept, how he preferred the oven set, which farms paid on time, and which needed gentler handling. He never asked about Caleb, never offered opinions about the road or the accident. He treated Susan not as a woman to be saved, but as one who had already endured something saving could not undo. That, more than anything, allowed her to stay. The first year passed in fragments. Susan measured it not in seasons, but in thresholds. The first day she did not wake expecting to hear Caleb's boots. The first morning she realized she had slept through the night without dreaming of the ravine. The first time Jane laughed without looking toward the door, as if waiting for someone to return. Susan told herself these were betrayals. Each small moment of ease felt like a step away from the life she had lost. She carried guilt quietly, like a second skin, guilt for surviving, guilt for adapting, guilt for finding that routine once something she had feared now steadied her when memory threatened to pull her under. There were days when the bakery felt unbearable, when the smell of bread rising in the ovens took her back to mornings beside Caleb, to plans spoken softly in the dark. Susan would turn away from her work then, press her palms flat against the table, and breathe until the wave passed. She learned which recipes hurt most, which ones had been his favorites. She avoided those when she could not. She baked them with tears slipping down her face, whispering apologies to a man who was no longer there to hear them. Fred noticed everything and commented on nothing. He walked Jane to the river on afternoons when Susan's hands shook too badly to knead. He fixed a loose shutter without being asked. When Susan worked too long, he set a plate of food beside her without a word. His presence did not demand acknowledgement. It simply remained. In the second year, the waiting changed. Susan stopped returning to the curve in the road, not because she had stopped believing, but because belief had become something too heavy to carry alongside motherhood. Jane was growing, asking questions Susan could not answer honestly without breaking. Susan began to understand that hope, when stretched too far, could become its own kind of cruelty. She started to let herself imagine a future, not the kind she had once dreamed of with Caleb, no distant horizons or unnamed places, but a future shaped by predictability, schooling for Jane, a roof that did not move, a life that did not require constant vigilance against loss. That was when she noticed the loneliness in Fred. It was not dramatic. It showed itself in small ways. In how he ate meals standing rather than sitting. In how he spoke to customers but rarely about himself. In the way the bakery fell silent at night, as if it were waiting for a voice that never came. Susan saw in him something familiar. Fred reminded her of her father, not in manner, but in steadiness, in the belief that showing up every day mattered more than grand declarations. Where Caleb had been motion, Fred was presence. Where Caleb had chased the horizon, Fred had built something solid and remained inside it. The affection between them did not arrive like passion. It arrived like trust. They talked in the evenings after Jane slept, voices low, the bakery quiet around them. Susan spoke of her childhood, of the weight of expectations she had once carried. Fred spoke of years spent working alone, of watching others pass through town while he stayed behind, keeping the ovens warm. Neither of them pretended to offer what the other had lost. They offered only what they were. When Fred finally asked Susan to marry him, he did so without urgency. He told her he understood if she said no, that he did not expect her to forget the past, that he did not want to replace anything that had mattered to her. He wanted only to build something honest, if she believed she could stand inside it. Susan did not answer right away. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who believed love meant following someone else's hunger. She thought of the woman she had become, the one who knew the cost of roads that did not lead back. In the end, she said yes, not because her pain had vanished, not because her love for Caleb had somehow been erased. She said yes because she recognized the woman she was now, and the life that suited her. Susan married Fred Meyer quietly, with Jane standing between them, her small hand tucked into Susan's skirt. The bakery doors remained open. The ovens stayed warm. Life, in its stubborn way, went on. Jane's voice did not rise when she spoke. It did not tremble or hesitate. It carried no drama, no fear. It held only recognition. "Mommy, it's Dad," for a brief, disorienting moment. Susan thought her daughter was playing. Children sometimes did that, attached familiar names to strangers, reshaped the world to fit what they wanted it to be. Susan opened her mouth to correct her, already reaching for the practiced words she used whenever Jane asked questions about the father she barely remembered. Then Susan followed the line of Jane's finger. The man stood just beyond the bakery door, half in shadow, half in the pale morning light. He looked thinner than the Caleb she remembered, his shoulders drawn in on themselves, his beard rough and uneven. His clothes were travel-worn, dust clinging to him like a second skin. But when he lifted his head, when his eyes met hers, something inside Susan broke open with a precision that took her breath away. It was him, not a memory, not a ghost shaped by grief. Caleb Williams stood alive on the threshold of the life she had rebuilt, 3 years after she had buried him without a body, without a grave, without answers. Susan did not move. Her hands remained pressed against the work table, flour dusting her skin. The world tilted, then stilled. Every sound, the crackle of the oven, the faint creak of the building. Jane's soft breathing seemed impossibly loud. Caleb took a single step forward, then stopped, as if afraid that crossing the doorway might shatter whatever fragile permission had brought him this far. "Susan," he said. Her name sounded wrong in his mouth. Too real, too present. For 3 years, she had spoken it only in her head, usually in anger, sometimes in longing, most often in exhaustion. Hearing it aloud felt like being pulled backward through time, dragged toward a version of herself she had worked so hard to survive. Jane tugged at her skirt again. "I knew it," she whispered, proud rather than afraid. "I knew he wasn't gone." Susan swallowed. She became suddenly aware of everything she stood to lose. Fred Meyer was not in the bakery. He had left earlier that morning to collect supplies, kissing her cheek the way he always did, trusting the world to stay as it was until he returned. The ovens were warm, the shelves were full, her life solid, carefully built, stood balanced on a fragile edge. "Come inside," Susan said at last, her voice steady in a way she did not feel. Caleb obeyed without question. He removed his hat as he stepped into the bakery, holding it against his chest like something sacred. He looked around slowly, taking in the space as if trying to understand how she had learned to live without him. His gaze lingered on Jane. On the way, Susan instinctively placed a hand at her daughter's back, anchoring her. "I looked for you," Caleb said quietly, "everywhere." Susan nodded once. So did I. There were 1,000 questions waiting between them. How had he survived? Where had he been? Why had it taken so long? None of them felt safe to ask. Answers could wait. What mattered was the truth standing between them now, unavoidable, breathing, irrevocable. Susan introduced him to the life he had missed. She told him about the bakery, about the years that had followed the accident, about the work that had kept her upright when waiting had nearly broken her. When she spoke Fred's name, she did not soften it. She did not apologize for it. "This is my husband," she said simply. When Caleb asked, the word landed between them with quiet violence. Caleb's face did not change. If anything, his expression grew calmer, as if some long-held tension had finally found its shape. He nodded once, slowly, absorbing the truth without protest. "I see," he said. He did not argue. He did not plead. He did not reach for her. That restraint unsettled Susan more than anger would have. It forced her to see him not as the man she had lost, but as the man he had become, someone shaped by survival, by silence, by years of walking alone. They spoke only briefly after that. Caleb told Jane he was proud of her, told Susan he was glad she had found safety. He thanked her for letting him inside, for not turning him away like a stranger. Then he stepped back into the street, pulling the door closed behind him with care. Susan watched him go, her chest tight, her thoughts tangled. She told herself that was the end of it. But the past rarely leaves without one final demand. The next morning, Caleb returned. He waited until Fred had gone, until the bakery was quiet except for the steady heat of the ovens. When Susan saw him standing there again, something inside her yielded not in fear, but in familiarity. "Come with me," Caleb said. There was no desperation in his voice, only longing, stripped bare. He spoke of unfinished things, of the life they had planned, of the road that had nearly killed him but never erased her from his mind. Susan hesitated. Then she said yes. They left before reason could catch up with memory. They rode hard until the bakery disappeared behind them, until the air smelled different, until the world began to look the way it once had when love and movement meant the same thing. They stopped at a small inn as night fell. Over dinner, Susan watched Caleb talk. Watched the way his eyes still sought the horizon even when he sat still. She listened to his plans, his certainty that the road could still give them something worth the cost. And slowly, quietly, she understood. She was not the woman he remembered. She had learned how to stay, how to build, how to live without chasing what lay just beyond reach. The life she had with Fred was not smaller. It was deeper. It asked more of her in ways adventure never had. Susan set her fork down. "I can't," she said. The words hurt. They were meant to. She told Caleb the truth that soulmate was not a promise of forever, but a season that shaped her into someone capable of choosing differently. She told him he should visit Jane often, that she would never deny him that, but she would not destroy the life she had fought to heal. Caleb listened, and this time he simply nodded. They parted before dawn. Susan rode back alone, the road familiar beneath her. When the bakery came into view, light spilling from its windows, she felt something settle inside her at last. Fred was there, waiting. Susan stepped into the life she had chosen, carrying her past with her, but no longer letting it lead the way. Susan closed the doors, swept the floor, and banked the fire the way she had learned to do long ago. The smell of bread lingered in the air, warm, grounding, familiar. Fred moved beside her without speaking, his presence steady and unassuming. Susan stood for a moment, hands resting on the work table, and let herself breathe. She had loved deeply. She had lost brutally. She had survived, adapted, and chosen the life that stayed. Now I hear a quiet truth in Susan's story. Not all love is meant to follow you through every chapter. Some love exists to teach you who you are capable of becoming. Other love came to stay with the person you became.